Welcome to the channel Vitamin Stories. Today's story takes us to Imperial Russia in the year 1873, to the birth of a boy named Sergei Vasilyevich Rachmaninoff, a child born with hands so unusually large that doctors examined him for deformities, teachers refused to teach him, and other children called him a monster. His hands could span 12 keys on a piano. To put that in perspective, the average pianist can span 8, maybe 9 keys. Rachmaninoff's hands were so large that when he stretched them across the keyboard, grown adults would gasp, children would point and whisper, and critics would later write that his grotesque physical abnormality was disturbing to witness. People called them cursed. They called them freakish. They called them the hands of something unholy. And for most of his young life, Sergei Rachmaninoff believed them. He hid his hands in his pockets behind his back under tables. He prayed every night for God to make them normal. He begged his mother to let him quit piano, to let him disappear into any life that didn't require him to put those hands on display. But those same hands, the ones that brought him shame and ridicule, would eventually create some of the most breathtakingly beautiful music the world has ever known. Those hands would play before czars and presidents. Those hands would compose Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece so profound that over a century later, it still moves millions to tears. Those hands would prove that what the world sees as your greatest flaw might actually be your most precious gift. This is a difficult story. It's a story about a boy tortured by his own body, about a young man driven to the brink of suicide by failure and depression, about a society that mistakes difference for defect. It's about the thin line between genius and madness, between gift and curse. And it's about the moment when one man decided to stop apologizing for who he was and instead become exactly what his hands were meant to create. So take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these important stories. And tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. The Rachmaninoff family was not poor, but they were not wealthy either. Sergei's father, Vasily, was a former military officer who had inherited an estate, but was slowly losing it to gambling and poor decisions. His mother, Lyubov, came from a family with military tradition and tried to maintain dignity even as their circumstances declined. When Sergei was born on April 1, 1873, in Semyonovo, Russia, the midwife who delivered him noticed his hands immediately. They seemed disproportionately large, even for a newborn. She said nothing at first, not wanting to frighten the new mother, but when the doctor arrived to examine the infant, he too paused over those hands. He measured them. He stretched the tiny fingers. He looked at Lyubov with concern in his eyes and asked if there was any history of unusual physical conditions in her family or her husband's. There was not. The doctor made notes in his journal and suggested they monitor the child's development carefully. He used a word that Lyubov would never forget: abnormality. As Sergei grew, so did his hands. By the time he was 4 years old, his hands were the size of a 7-year-old's. By the time he was 7, they looked like they belonged to a grown man. When he held his mother's hand while walking through the streets of St. Petersburg, where the family had moved, people would stare. Some would whisper. Once an old woman crossed herself when she saw him, as if warding off evil. Sergei learned early to be ashamed. The Rachmaninoff family had a piano, as many families of their class did. Music was considered an essential part of a proper education. When Sergei was 5, his mother decided it was time to begin his piano lessons. She was an accomplished pianist herself, and thought she would teach him the basics before hiring a formal instructor. The first time Sergei's small hands touched the keys, something strange happened. Even at that young age, even with hands that should have been clumsy and oversized, he played with an unusual naturalness. His mother showed him where middle C was, and within minutes he was picking out simple melodies by ear. It was as if the piano had been waiting for him. But when Lyubov tried to find a proper piano teacher for her son, she encountered obstacle after obstacle. The first teacher came to their home, a stern woman named Madame Orlova, who had taught piano to the children of St. Petersburg's better families for 30 years. She sat Sergei at the piano bench, asked him to place his hands on the keys, and when he did, she actually drew back slightly. She stared at his hands for a long moment. Then she asked him to play a simple scale. He played it perfectly. She asked him to play a chord. He did his small fingers stretching across an interval that should have been impossible for a child his age. Madame Orlova stood up, gathered her sheet music, and told Lyubov that she could not, in good conscience, take Sergei as a student. When pressed for a reason, she said that his hands were not suited for proper piano technique, and that training him would be like teaching a spider to dance. She left and never returned. The second teacher lasted only one lesson. He kept staring at Sergei's hands with a mixture of fascination and disgust, asking him to stretch them, to show their full span, measuring them with his own hands, as if Sergei were a curiosity in a medical exhibition. At the end of the lesson, he told Lyubov that while the boy had some musical aptitude, his physical abnormality would prevent him from ever achieving true artistry. The piano, he said, was designed for human hands. Young Sergei, listening from the doorway, understood what that meant. His hands were not human. He was not human. A third teacher came, then a fourth. Each found a different excuse. Too young, they said, though they taught other children his age. Not ready, they claimed, though he could play pieces most 7-year-olds struggled with. The real reason was always the same, even when unspoken. Those hands. Those terrible, grotesque, impossible hands. At school, things were even worse. The other children noticed his hands immediately. They gave him names. Spider Boy was the most common. Some called him Devil's Hands because his fingers seemed unnaturally long. One particularly cruel child started a rumor that Sergei's mother had been frightened by a monster while pregnant, and that's why he was born wrong. Children can be vicious in their honesty. Adults hide their cruelty behind politeness, but children simply stare and point and laugh. Sergei endured it all in silence. He learned to keep his hands hidden. He sat on them during class. He kept them in his pockets during recess. He developed a habit of clasping them behind his back when standing still, a posture he would maintain even into adulthood. At night, alone in his room, he would look at his hands by candlelight and cry. He would pray to God to make them normal. He would beg for a miracle, for a transformation, for anything that would make him like the other children. He was 7 years old, and he already hated a fundamental part of himself. His mother watched all of this with a breaking heart. She saw her talented, sensitive boy withdrawing into himself. She heard him crying at night. She noticed how he flinched when anyone looked at his hands. And she made a decision. She would find someone to teach him. No matter how many teachers she had to approach, no matter how many rejections they endured, she would find someone who could see past the physical and recognize the music inside her son. Because Lyubov had noticed something the teachers had not. When Sergei sat at the piano alone, when he thought no one was listening, he didn't play like a child. He played like someone much older, someone who understood that music could say what words could not. His oversized hands would move across the keys with surprising grace, finding chords and progressions that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. She had heard him late one evening playing a melody he had created himself. It was simple, but achingly beautiful, full of a sadness no 7-year-old should be able to express. She stood outside his door, listening, and realized that whatever God had done when he made her son's hands, it had not been a curse. It had been something else entirely. She just needed to find someone who could see it. In the winter of 1882, when Sergei was 9 years old, his family's financial situation had deteriorated to the point where they could no longer afford their home in St. Petersburg. The estate his father had inherited was sold to pay debts, and the family moved to a smaller apartment. It was a humiliating descent for a family that had once held status, and Sergei Rachmaninoff responded by drinking more and caring less. But the move brought one unexpected benefit. A family friend mentioned a piano teacher in Moscow named Nikolai Sergeyevich Zverev, a man known for taking only the most talented students and training them with ruthless efficiency. He was not a warm man. He was not particularly kind, but he produced results. Several of his students had gone on to successful careers as concert pianists. Lyubov wrote to him explaining her son's unusual gift. She was careful in her letter mentioning his musical ability while downplaying the physical aspect that had caused so many rejections. She sent a recording of Sergei playing made on one of the new phonograph cylinders that were becoming available. Zverev's response was brief and non-committal. He would hear the boy in person. If the boy had talent, he would consider it. Nothing more was promised. The journey to Moscow took 2 days. Sergei barely spoke the entire time. He knew this was likely his last chance. His mother had told him so not to pressure him, but because she believed in honesty. If Zverev rejected him, there would be no more piano teachers. The family could not afford to keep searching, keep hoping, keep enduring rejections. Zverev's studio was in a large, cold building that smelled of wood polish and old books. When they arrived, they were shown into a practice room with a beautiful Becker grand piano. Zverev was already there, a man in his 50s with a severe face and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with cold calculation. He looked at Sergei without warmth or curiosity. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the piano bench. Sergei sat. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys. He was acutely aware of Zverev staring at them. Here it comes, he thought. Here comes the moment when he sees them and changes his mind. But Zverev said nothing about his hands. Instead, he placed a piece of sheet music on the stand. It was a Chopin prelude, not particularly difficult, but requiring precision and emotional understanding. "Play," Zverev said. Sergei played. His hands, which had caused him nothing but shame, moved across the keys with natural authority. The music filled the cold room, bringing warmth and life to it. When he finished, there was silence. Zverev walked to the piano and, without asking permission, took one of Sergei's hands in his own. He examined it like a scientist examining a specimen. He measured the span, testing how far the fingers could stretch. He felt the strength in the palm, the flexibility in the joints. "Can you reach this?" Zverev placed Sergei's hand on the keyboard, stretching it to span an octave plus 4 notes, a distance of 12 keys. It should have been impossible for a 9-year-old. Sergei did it easily. And this Zverev positioned the hand for an even wider stretch. Again, Sergei managed it, though it required concentration. Zverev released his hand and stepped back. He looked at Lyubov. "Your son," he said, has the hands of a freak. Sergei felt his heart sink. Here it was, the rejection. He started to stand ready to leave, ready to accept that music was not meant for him. "Sit down," Zverev said sharply. Sergei sat. Zverev turned back to Lyubov. "But freaks," he continued, "are often what the world needs when it has grown too comfortable with normal. I will take him. But understand this, I do not coddle my students. I do not praise easily. If he studies with me, he will work harder than he has ever worked. He will cry. He will want to quit. And I will not let him." He looked down at Sergei. "Those hands that other teachers feared, I'm going to teach you to use them. Not in spite of what they are, but because of it." Do you understand? Sergei didn't not really? But he nodded anyway. "Good," Zverev said. "We begin tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Don't be late." The training that followed was unlike anything Sergei had experienced. Zverev was true to his word. He was harsh, demanding, and absolutely uncompromising. He woke Sergei before dawn and worked him until his fingers bled. He assigned exercises specifically designed to push the limits of what those unusual hands could do. Where other teachers had told Sergei to keep his hands closer together to play within normal ranges, Zverev did the opposite. He gave him pieces that required massive stretches, unusual hand positions, chord voicings that would be impossible for most pianists. When Sergei struggled, when he complained that it hurt, when he said he couldn't do it, Zverev would simply say, "Then you're not trying hard enough." There was no sympathy in Zverev's approach. But there was also no shame. He never once suggested that Sergei's hands were a problem to overcome. Instead, he treated them as a tool to be mastered, no different from any other physical attribute. 3 months into the training, Zverev placed a piece of sheet music in front of Sergei that made his stomach drop. It was Franz Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. It was considered nearly impossible even for adult concert pianists. The leaps, the runs, the hand stretches required were beyond what most human hands could manage. "Why are you giving me this?" Sergei asked, close to tears. "I can't play this. Nobody my age can play this. Nobody with normal hands can play this the way it's meant to be played," Zverev corrected. "But you don't have normal hands. You have better ones. Now stop complaining and start practicing." For weeks, Sergei worked on that piece. His fingers developed calluses. His wrists ached. He made mistakes, constantly stumbling over passages that required his hands to leap across the keyboard, to stretch across intervals that seemed designed to mock him. But slowly, impossibly, the piece began to take shape. The stretches that should have been impossible became merely difficult. The leaps that should have broken his concentration became automatic. And one day, 3 months after Zverev had given him the music, Sergei played La Campanella from beginning to end without a single mistake. When he finished, he looked up at Zverev, expecting, what praise recognition? Some acknowledgement of what he had just accomplished. Zverev was sitting in his chair, arms crossed, face expressionless. Again, he said, "And this time play it with feeling. Right now it's just notes. Make it music." Sergei wanted to scream. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that what he had just done was impossible, that he deserved some recognition for achieving it. Instead, he placed his hands back on the keys and played it again. This time, something different happened. This time, instead of thinking about the technical challenges, instead of worrying about the stretches and the leaps, he simply let his hands do what they had learned to do. And in that letting go, he discovered something remarkable. His hands, the ones he had spent his whole life hiding and hating, the ones that had brought him nothing but mockery and rejection, could do things other pianists could only dream of. They could reach across the keyboard like birds in flight. They could strike chords with power and delicacy simultaneously. They could make the piano sing in ways that normal hands simply couldn't. When he finished the second playthrough, there was silence in the room. Then Zverev stood up, walked to the piano, and did something he had never done before. He placed his hand on Sergei's shoulder. "There," he said quietly. "Now you're beginning to understand. Those hands aren't a curse, boy. They're a gift you haven't learned to unwrap yet." It was the closest thing to praise Sergei had ever received from Zverev. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, he looked at his hands and felt something other than shame. He felt possibility. In 1885, at the age of 12, Sergei Rachmaninoff took the entrance examination for the Moscow Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in Russia. By this time, he had spent 3 years under Zverev's brutal tutelage and had developed into a formidable pianist. But he was still just a boy, and his hands still drew stares and whispers wherever he went. The examination took place in a large hall with excellent acoustics. A panel of 5 professors sat at a long table, their faces impassive as they watched candidate after candidate perform. Some were brilliant, some were mediocre, some were clearly unprepared and left the room in tears. When Sergei's name was called, he walked to the piano with his hands clasped behind his back, a habit he still couldn't break. As he sat down and placed his hands on the keys, he heard the sharp intake of breath from one of the professors. Another leaned forward, squinting, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "Excuse me," one professor said, a heavy-set man with a thick beard. "Young man, would you mind stretching your hands across the keyboard for us?" It was beginning already. The questions, the stares, the treating of him as a curiosity rather than a musician. But Sergei had learned from Zverev that the only response to doubt was demonstration. So he placed his left hand on the keyboard and stretched it easily, spanning 12 keys. The professors murmured among themselves. "Extraordinary," one said. "Disturbing," muttered another. "Gentlemen," a third professor interrupted an older man with kind eyes named Sergei Taneyev. "Perhaps we should hear him play before we turn this into a medical examination." There was some embarrassed coughing, some shuffling of papers. Then Taneyev nodded at Sergei. "Please proceed with your prepared piece." Sergei had chosen one of the most difficult pieces in his repertoire, a Beethoven sonata, that showcased both technical virtuosity and emotional depth. As he played, the murmuring stopped. The professors leaned back in their chairs. Some closed their eyes. Some leaned forward, watching his hands move across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then Taneyev began to clap. The other professors joined in, some enthusiastically, some more reluctantly. The vote to admit him was not unanimous. 2 of the 5 professors argued that his physical abnormality might set a concerning precedent for the conservatory's standards. But Taneyev and 2 others insisted that talent was talent, and that the conservatory existed to nurture genius, not to enforce conformity to physical norms. Sergei was admitted. But the notation in his file read, "Accepted with reservations." Physical anomaly noted. Progress to be monitored carefully. Life at the Moscow Conservatory was both a blessing and a curse for young Sergei. On one hand, he was surrounded by serious musicians, by people who understood the language of music and could appreciate true skill. On the other hand, he was also surrounded by competitors, by young men and women who saw music as a pathway to fame and fortune, and who viewed anyone different as either a threat or a target. The conservatory's students came from all over Russia, and even from other countries. They were the best young musicians their regions had to offer, which meant they were also often the most ambitious, the most competitive, and the most willing to use whatever advantage they could find. One of those students was Alexander Scriabin. Scriabin was Sergei's age, born just a few months apart. But where Sergei was large and ungainly, his body not quite sure what to do with itself, as it grew, Scriabin was compact and graceful. Where Sergei's hands were massive and drew stares, Scriabin's were elegant, with long, tapered fingers that looked like they belonged in a painting of an aristocrat. And Scriabin was brilliant. There was no denying it. He played with a natural fluidity that Sergei had to work hard to achieve. He sight-read difficult pieces as easily as others read newspapers. He charmed the professors, particularly the female ones, with his good looks and cultured manners. The two boys were placed in the same advanced piano class, and immediately comparisons began. The other students would whisper, "Scriabin is the natural talent, but Rachmaninoff has those hands. Scriabin has the technique, but Rachmaninoff has the power. Scriabin will be the star, but Rachmaninoff is the curiosity." For his part, Scriabin was never overtly cruel to Sergei. He didn't need to be. His very existence was a reminder of everything Sergei was not normal, accepted effortlessly, gifted. But occasionally Scriabin would make small comments delivered with a smile that could be interpreted as friendly or mocking depending on your perspective. "Must be challenging," he said once, after watching Sergei practice a particularly difficult passage, having to account for such unusual hand positions. "I imagine it makes learning proper technique rather complicated." Another time after a recital where both boys had performed, "You know, Sergei, you really do create quite a visual impression when you play. Very memorable. People won't soon forget the sight of you at the piano." Was it meant as a compliment? Was it meant as an insult? Sergei could never quite tell which made it worse. If Scriabin had been openly hostile, Sergei could have hated him cleanly. But this ambiguous courtesy, this surface friendliness that might hide contempt, was harder to navigate. Sergei began to watch Scriabin obsessively comparing every aspect of their playing. When Scriabin performed flawlessly, Sergei felt sick with envy. When Scriabin made a mistake, Sergei felt a shameful flash of satisfaction. He knew this jealousy was poisonous, knew it was destroying his ability to simply enjoy music, but he couldn't stop himself. The conservatory held regular student recitals open to the public and often attended by Moscow's music critics. These recitals were important. A good review could launch a student's career before they even graduated. A bad review could be crushing. In his third year at the conservatory, when Sergei was 15, he was selected to perform at one of these public recitals. He chose a demanding program, 2 Chopin etudes, a Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody, and a piece he had composed himself, a short prelude that showcased the unique capabilities of his hands. The night of the recital, the hall was full. Sergei saw several of Moscow's prominent critics in the audience, including the feared Semyon Kruglikov, known for his savage reviews of young performers. He saw his mother sitting in the third row with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He saw Scriabin, who was not performing that night, sitting near the back with a group of other students. When Sergei walked onto the stage, he heard the whispers begin immediately. He saw people nudging their neighbors, pointing at his hands. He saw Kruglikov lean over to the person next to him and say something that made them both smirk. He sat at the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and played. He played brilliantly. He knew he did. The Chopin etudes were flawless, technically perfect, and emotionally resonant. The Liszt was powerful and dramatic, making full use of his ability to reach across the keyboard in ways other pianists couldn't. And his own composition, the piece written specifically for hands like his, was something new and strange and beautiful. When he finished, the applause was enthusiastic. People stood. His mother was crying. Even some of the critics were clapping, though Kruglikov remained seated, his face thoughtful but unreadable. Sergei left the stage feeling for the first time that maybe he had proven something. Maybe he had shown them that his hands were not a deformity, but a gift. The next morning's newspapers destroyed that hope. Kruglikov's review appeared in the Moscow Gazette, and it was devastating. He acknowledged Sergei's technical skill, admitting that the boy could play difficult passages with apparent ease. But then came the paragraph that Sergei would never forget. However, one cannot escape the disturbing visual element of Mr. Rachmaninoff's performance. His hands, grotesquely oversized and stretched across the keyboard in positions that seem to defy natural human anatomy, create a spectacle that is at times difficult to watch. One feels that one is witnessing not art, but a kind of circus performance, a display of physical abnormality rather than musical sensitivity. While his technical execution is competent, the overall effect is marred by this unavoidable physicality. One must question whether such unnatural attributes can ever truly serve serious musical expression, or whether they will always remain merely a curiosity, a sideshow attraction, rather than genuine artistry. Other reviews were kinder, but Kruglikov's words were the ones that spread. The ones that other students read aloud in the conservatory hallways, sometimes with genuine sympathy, sometimes with barely hidden glee. The ones that made Sergei's hands, which had just begun to feel like tools of music, feel once again like deformities to be hidden. He found Scriabin's reaction particularly cutting. When they passed each other in the hallway the day after the reviews came out, Scriabin stopped him. "I read Kruglikov's review," he said. "Absolutely barbaric, the way he focused on your appearance rather than your artistry. You mustn't let it discourage you." The words were sympathetic. The tone was sympathetic. But there was something in Scriabin's eyes, some small gleam of satisfaction that told Sergei the truth. Scriabin was glad. Glad that Sergei had been cut down. Glad that the hierarchy was maintained. That night alone in his dormitory room, Sergei looked at his hands and felt all the old hatred come rushing back. For a few years, he had begun to believe Zverev's words had begun to see his hands as gifts. But Kruglikov's review had reminded him of the truth that the world saw he was a freak, a circus act, a sideshow. He thought about quitting, about leaving the conservatory, about finding some other life where his hands wouldn't matter, wouldn't be on display, wouldn't be subject to public judgment and mockery. But then he remembered something Zverev had told him during one of their lessons. The world will always have opinions about you. The only question is whether you'll let those opinions become your truth. Sergei didn't quit. But something had hardened in him that night. A determination, yes, but also a bitterness. He would prove them all wrong. He would become so good that they couldn't dismiss him. He would write music that only he could play, that would force the world to acknowledge that his hands were not a curse, but a unique gift. It would take him years. It would nearly destroy him. But he would do it, or die trying. By 1897, Sergei Rachmaninoff was 24 years old and stood on the edge of what should have been his breakthrough moment. He had graduated from the Moscow Conservatory with the highest honors. He had composed numerous piano pieces that showcased his virtuosity. He had gained a reputation as a formidable pianist, even if some critics still couldn't resist mentioning his unusual physical appearance in their reviews. But piano pieces, no matter how impressive, were not enough to establish someone as a truly important composer. For that, you needed to write for orchestra. You needed to create something large-scale, something that demonstrated your ability to think beyond the keyboard, to orchestrate for multiple instruments, to build musical architecture that could fill a concert hall. Rachmaninoff had spent 3 years working on his Symphony No. 1 in D minor. It was ambitious, dark, and deeply personal. He poured into it all his years of struggle, all his pain and determination. The symphony was complex, demanding, and unlike anything else being written in Russia at the time. It was in many ways a statement: I am not just a pianist with unusual hands. I am a complete musician, a composer of serious art. The premiere was scheduled for March 28, 1897, at the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. It was to be conducted by Alexander Glazunov himself, a respected composer and a powerful figure in Russian musical circles. This should have been a positive sign. Having Glazunov conduct your premiere was an honor, a signal that serious musicians took you seriously. But there were rumors about Glazunov that Rachmaninoff tried to ignore. Rumors that he drank heavily. Rumors that he was jealous of younger composers. Rumors that he had agreed to conduct the premiere only because he was contractually obligated, not because he respected the work. Rachmaninoff traveled to St. Petersburg for the final rehearsals, and immediately he knew something was wrong. Glazunov conducted the rehearsals with barely concealed disdain. He made no effort to understand the symphony's emotional arc. He rushed through some sections and dragged others. He seemed bored, irritated, as if conducting this work was beneath him. After one particularly disastrous rehearsal, Rachmaninoff approached Glazunov and politely suggested some tempo adjustments, some moments where the music needed more space to breathe. Glazunov looked at him with barely concealed contempt. Perhaps Glazunov said his words slightly slurred. If you had written a more coherent piece, it would be easier to conduct. As it stands, I'm doing my best with what you've given me. The smell of alcohol on Glazunov's breath was unmistakable. It was 2 p.m. Rachmaninoff felt panic rising. This was his symphony, his statement to the world, and it was being conducted by a drunk who held it in contempt. But what could he do? The premiere was in 2 days. The programs were printed. The critics had been invited. Canceling now would be seen as cowardice, would mark him as unreliable. He had no choice but to hope that on the night of the performance, Glazunov would pull himself together. The night of March 28th arrived. The hall was full. Rachmaninoff sat in a box seat, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white. He saw critics he recognized, including the hateful Kruglikov. He saw colleagues from the conservatory. He saw, in the back of the hall, Scriabin, who had come from Moscow for the premiere. The orchestra took their places. Glazunov walked to the podium, and even from a distance, Rachmaninoff could see the unsteadiness in his gait. The symphony began, and it was immediately clear that disaster was unfolding. Glazunov's conducting was erratic, unfocused. He missed cues. He confused the orchestra with conflicting gestures. Tempos that should have been moderate were rushed. Sections that should have built gradually were attacked with inappropriate force. The careful balance Rachmaninoff had orchestrated between instruments was destroyed by Glazunov's incompetent direction. The musicians did their best, but they were confused trying to follow a conductor who seemed to have no clear vision of the piece. The symphony lurched from section to section, like a wounded animal bleeding beauty wherever Glazunov's baton touched it. Rachmaninoff sat in his box, watching his work being murdered in real time. He felt physically ill. At one point, he had to leave his seat and go into the hallway where he vomited into a waste bin. An attendant asked if he needed a doctor. He shook his head and returned to his seat, unable to leave, unable to stop watching the catastrophe. When the symphony finally mercifully ended, the applause was scattered and brief. Polite, obligatory, quickly dying out. People began leaving even before the applause stopped. Rachmaninoff saw critics already making notes, their faces showing disdain or pity. He couldn't bring himself to go backstage. He left through a side door and walked through the cold St. Petersburg night, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his mind reeling. The reviews the next day were as brutal as he had feared. Worse, even. Because while some critics noted the conducting had been problematic, most focused their fury on the composition itself. Rachmaninoff's Symphony No. 1 is a catastrophe, wrote Kruglikov, always ready with the knife. Chaotic, disjointed, lacking any coherent musical thought. One wonders if Mr. Rachmaninoff's abnormal physical attributes have perhaps affected his mental faculties as well, rendering him incapable of the ordered thinking required for symphonic composition. Another critic wrote, "This symphony is proof that some musicians should remain at the keyboard where they belong." Mr. Rachmaninoff's attempt at orchestral composition reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of musical architecture. Perhaps he should stick to simpler, more manageable forms of expression. The Moscow papers were no kinder. Even colleagues were brutal. One composer Rachmaninoff had considered a friend wrote, "It's as if Rachmaninoff's hands, impressive though they are, at the piano, strangled all musical sense from his brain when attempting to write for orchestra." Everywhere the message was the same: he had failed. Spectacularly. Publicly. His reach had exceeded his grasp, and the whole of Russian musical society had witnessed his humiliation. Rachmaninoff returned to Moscow in a state of shock. He told no one what he was feeling. He went through the motions of his daily life, teaching a few piano students, attending some concerts, maintaining his routine. But inside, something had broken. He stopped composing. Not intentionally at first. He would sit at his desk, put blank manuscript paper in front of him, take up his pen, and nothing. The music that had once flowed from him so naturally had simply stopped. The internal voice that whispered melodies and harmonies had gone silent. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Still nothing came. He would wake up at night in a panic, convinced that he had lost whatever gift he'd once possessed, that the critics had been right, that he was just a pianist with freakish hands, and nothing more. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. He stopped seeing friends. He stopped attending concerts. He barely left his apartment except to fulfill his teaching obligations, and even those he was considering abandoning. What was the point? What was the point of any of it? His hands, which had once been a source of shame, then briefly a source of pride, now represented nothing but failure. He would look at them and think, these hands that can span 12 keys, that can play passages other pianists can't imagine, what good are they? They couldn't save my symphony. They couldn't prevent my humiliation. They're just hands. Large, grotesque, useless hands attached to a man who thought he was a composer, but was nothing but a fool. For 3 years, this continued. 3 years during which Sergei Rachmaninoff, once considered one of Russia's most promising young composers, wrote not a single note of music. 3 years during which he descended into a depression so deep that friends began to worry he might not survive it. His mother came to visit and was shocked by what she found. Her son, once vibrant despite his struggles, had become a ghost. He barely ate. He rarely slept. When she tried to talk to him about his music, he would simply shake his head and leave the room. "I'm not a composer," he told her once, his voice flat and dead. "I was fooling myself." The critics were right. I should never have tried. One bad performance doesn't define you, she said, desperate to reach him. It wasn't just a bad performance, he replied. It was proof that I'm not who I thought I was. Those hands, Mother, the ones you told me were special. They're just hands. And I'm just a man who can play piano adequately. Nothing more. Friends staged an intervention. Among them was Nikolai Dahl, a physician, who had begun incorporating hypnotherapy into his practice, a relatively new technique that was showing promise in treating psychological ailments. Dahl was also an amateur musician and had long admired Rachmaninoff's work. Come see me, Dahl told Rachmaninoff. Not as a friend, but as a patient. What can it hurt? You're not composing now anyway. Give me 3 months. If it doesn't help, you've lost nothing. Rachmaninoff was so tired, so depleted that he agreed simply because he didn't have the energy to refuse. And so began the slow, painful process of rebuilding a broken man. Dr. Nikolai Dahl's clinic was in a quiet part of Moscow, a building that smelled of medicinal herbs and furniture polish. Rachmaninoff began seeing him in January of 1900, 3 years almost to the day since the catastrophic premiere of his first symphony. The sessions were unlike anything Rachmaninoff had experienced. Dahl would have him sit in a comfortable chair in a dimly lit room. He would speak in a low, steady voice, guiding Rachmaninoff into a state of deep relaxation. And then, once Rachmaninoff was in this hypnotic state, Dahl would repeat certain phrases, certain affirmations over and over. You are a great composer. You will compose again. Your talent has not left you. The music is still inside you, waiting. At first, Rachmaninoff felt ridiculous. This was nonsense, he thought. Words couldn't heal what was broken inside him. But Dahl was patient and persistent. You don't have to believe it, he said. Just listen. Just let the words exist in your mind. Weeks passed. Then months. Rachmaninoff continued his sessions with Dahl, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. But one day, walking through Moscow, Rachmaninoff heard a street musician playing a simple folk melody, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something stir inside him. A response. A musical thought. It was the tiniest spark, but it was there. He didn't tell anyone. He was afraid that speaking about it would make it disappear. But he went home, and for the first time in 3 years, he sat at his piano not to mechanically practice, but to explore. He played the folk melody he had heard, then began to improvise variations on it. His hands, which had felt leaden and useless for so long, remembered what it felt like to create. The next day, he told Dahl about it. Dahl smiled. Good, he said. The music never left you, Sergei. You only convinced yourself it had. Now we need to convince you otherwise. The sessions continued, and the affirmations became more specific. You will write a piano concerto. It will be your greatest work. Your hands will create what only your hands can create. And slowly, Rachmaninoff began to believe it might be possible. In the summer of 1900, Rachmaninoff rented a small cottage in the countryside away from Moscow, away from memories of failure, away from everyone and everything except his piano and his manuscript paper. He told Dahl he was going to try to compose again. Don't try, Dahl told him. Just compose. The trying is what blocks you. Trust your hands. Trust your hands. The irony wasn't lost on Rachmaninoff. The hands he had hated, then learned to use, then blamed for his failure. Now he was being told to trust them. But what choice did he have? He had spent 3 years in darkness. Anything was better than that. The first day at the cottage, he sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. And he made himself a promise whatever he wrote, it would be honest. It would not try to please critics. It would not try to prove anything to anyone. It would simply be the music that his hands, his heart, his mind wanted to create. He began with a simple melody, something that had been humming in the back of his mind for weeks. It was melancholic, tinged with sadness, but also with hope. As he played it, he felt emotions he had suppressed for 3 years begin to surface. Pain, yes, but also beauty. Loss, yes, but also the possibility of redemption. This would be a piano concerto. Not because the world needed another piano concerto, but because he needed to write one. He needed to prove to himself that he could still create something of value, and it would be written specifically for his hands. All those unique capabilities, all those stretches and reaches that had made him a curiosity, a sideshow. He would build this music around them. Not to show off, but because that's what felt authentic. If his hands could span 12 keys, then the music should use 12 keys. If his hands could reach across the keyboard in ways others couldn't, then let the music reach. Day after day he worked. Sometimes the music flowed easily. Other times he struggled, fought with it, crumpled up pages, and started over. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. This concerto was becoming more than just a piece of music. It was his resurrection, his proof that the 3 years of silence hadn't destroyed him. He structured the concerto in 3 movements. The first would be powerful dramatic, establishing the themes that would develop throughout the piece. The second would be lyrical, achingly beautiful, the kind of melody that could make people weep. The third would be triumphant, virtuosic, a celebration of what the piano could do in the right hands. But more than the structure, more than the technical elements, Rachmaninoff poured his soul into this music. Every note contained some piece of his journey: the childhood mockery, the years with Zverev, the conservatory struggles, the catastrophic premiere, the 3 years of darkness, and finally this fragile new hope that maybe, just maybe, he could compose again. There was a passage in the first movement that required the pianist's hands to span an interval of 12 keys in rapid succession, creating a cascading effect that was both beautiful and technically daunting. Only someone with Rachmaninoff's handspan could play it as written. He knew this would invite criticism, more comments about his freakish abilities, more dismissal as circus tricks rather than art. He didn't care anymore. This was who he was. These were his hands. This was his music. By October of 1900, he had a complete first draft. It was rough, needing refinement and polish, but it existed. He had written a piano concerto. After 3 years of silence, he had proven that the music hadn't died. He returned to Moscow and showed the draft to a few trusted friends. Their reactions were enthusiastic, though carefully so. They knew how fragile he still was. But there was genuine excitement in their voices. This was good, they told him. This was really good. Rachmaninoff decided to dedicate the concerto to Dr. Dahl. Without Dahl's patience, without those hypnotherapy sessions that had seemed so ridiculous at first, this music would never have existed. The dedication page would read, "To N.V. Dahl." Now came the difficult part, preparing for a premiere. And this time Rachmaninoff was determined that nothing would go wrong. He would conduct it himself. He would perform the piano solo himself. He would not leave his work in the hands of someone who might destroy it. The Moscow Philharmonic agreed to premiere the work. Rehearsals were scheduled for October 1901, with the performance planned for October 27th. But as the rehearsals began, Rachmaninoff discovered a new problem: the orchestra was struggling with his music. The concerto was technically demanding not just for the pianist, but for the orchestra as well. There were passages where the piano and orchestra had to be perfectly synchronized, where even a slight mistiming would ruin the effect. Some of the musicians complained. "This is too complex," a violinist said during one rehearsal. "The rhythms are too tricky. No audience will be able to follow this." A cellist added, "And some of these piano passages, can they even be played? These stretches you've written, they seem impossible." Rachmaninoff stopped the rehearsal. He walked to the piano and sat down. "Listen," he said simply, and he played the passage in question. His hands stretched across the keyboard, moving with a fluidity that seemed to defy the physical limitations other pianists faced. The notes cascaded and sang, creating textures that would indeed be impossible for normal hands. When he finished, there was silence. Then the conductor, who had been watching carefully, began to clap slowly. "Gentlemen," he said to the orchestra, "I believe we need to simply accept that what we're witnessing is unique. Mr. Rachmaninoff hasn't written an impossible piece. He's written a piece that only he can play properly, which means we need to rise to his level, not pull him down to ours." The rehearsals continued, and slowly the orchestra began to understand the music. They began to feel how the piano and orchestra were meant to work together, how the concerto was a conversation between soloist and ensemble, how Rachmaninoff had written something that was both deeply personal and universally emotional. As the premiere date approached, Rachmaninoff felt the old fears returning. What if it failed again? What if the critics savaged it? What if he had spent a year creating something that would only bring more humiliation? The night before the premiere, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his apartment looking at his hands in the lamplight. These hands that had caused him so much pain. These hands that had been called monstrous, freakish, cursed. These hands that had written this music. He thought about the 7-year-old boy who had prayed for normal hands. He thought about the teenager who had endured Kruglikhov's savage review. He thought about the broken man who had believed his talent was gone forever. And he thought about the music he had written. Music that could only exist because his hands were exactly as they were. Not in spite of their uniqueness, but because of it. "If this fails," he whispered to himself, "at least I failed, being myself. At least I didn't hide anymore." He placed his hands on the table, spreading them to their full span. 12 keys. A distance that had defined his life for better and worse. Tomorrow, he told his hands, we find out if you were a curse or a gift. Tomorrow, we get our answer. October 27, 1901. The Moscow Conservatory's Great Hall was filled to capacity. Word had spread about Rachmaninoff's new concerto, and curiosity had drawn a large crowd. Some came because they genuinely admired his piano playing and were curious about his new composition. Some came because they remembered the catastrophic premiere of his first symphony and wanted to witness either his redemption or his further humiliation. And some came simply because attending premieres was what cultured Muscovites did. The critics were there in force. Rachmaninoff saw Kruglikov in the third row, that same expression of disdainful anticipation on his face. Other critics clustered in groups, their notebooks ready, their pens poised to either praise or destroy. Rachmaninoff also saw friendly faces. His mother was there, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale with anxiety. Dahl was there offering a small, encouraging nod when their eyes met. And in the back of his hall, trying to look casual but clearly interested, was Alexander Scriabin. His presence was complicated. They were still rivals, still competitors, but there was also a grudging mutual respect between them. Scriabin had come to witness this moment, whatever it might bring. Backstage, Rachmaninoff stood alone, his hands trembling slightly. The orchestra was tuning. He could hear the familiar cacophony of instruments finding their pitch, that strange music that preceded all performances. In a few minutes, he would walk onto that stage. He would sit at the piano. And he would perform music that he had pulled from the depths of his despair, music that represented everything he had suffered and survived. A stage manager knocked on his door. 5 minutes, Mr. Rachmaninoff. Thank you, he managed to say. He looked at his reflection in a small mirror on the wall. At 31 years old, he looked older. The 3 years of depression had left their mark in lines around his eyes, in the set of his mouth. But there was also something new there: determination. He had been broken, and he had rebuilt himself. Whatever happened tonight, that fact remained. He held up his hands in front of the mirror, looking at them the way he had done countless times throughout his life. But this time, instead of shame or doubt, he felt something like gratitude. These hands had carried him here. These impossible, unusual, remarkable hands. "Let's go," he whispered to them. He walked through the backstage corridors and emerged into the wings of the stage. The audience noise was a low rumble, conversations and laughter and the rustle of programs. The orchestra was seated, instruments ready. The concertmaster gave him a quick nod of encouragement. Rachmaninoff stepped onto the stage. The audience reaction was immediate. Applause, yes, but also that familiar undercurrent of whispers. He saw people lean toward each other, pointing at his hands as he walked to the piano. He heard fragments of sentences. Those hands. Still so strange to see. Wonder if he can actually... He sat at the piano bench, adjusted his position, placed his hands on the keys. From his position at the keyboard, he could see the conductor, a stern but fair man named Siloti, raising his baton. The hall fell silent. And then the music began. The concerto opened not with the piano, but with the orchestra, a series of deep, resonant chords that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. They were like bells, tolling like the voice of something ancient and profound. The audience, expecting perhaps a bright, cheerful opening, fell into a deeper silence, drawn into the darkness and beauty of the sound. Then Rachmaninoff's hands touched the keys. What emerged was unlike anything the audience had heard before. His opening chords required a span that made people audibly gasp. His left hand held down bass notes, while his right hand swept across nearly 2 octaves of the keyboard, creating harmonies that would be physically impossible for pianists with normal handspans. But it wasn't just the technical achievement that stunned them. It was the emotion. The music was dark, yes, but it was also achingly beautiful. It spoke of loneliness and longing, of pain, and the desperate hope for redemption. It was the sound of a soul that had been broken and was slowly, painfully putting itself back together. In the audience, Rachmaninoff's mother began to cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. She heard in this music her son's entire journey. The childhood mockery, the years of struggle, the catastrophic failure, the darkness that had almost consumed him. All of it was in these notes. The first movement built and built the piano and orchestra engaged in a conversation that was sometimes aggressive, sometimes tender, always honest. There were passages where Rachmaninoff's hands flew across the keyboard in ways that made the other pianists in the audience shake their heads in disbelief. How was he doing that? How were his fingers moving so fast while simultaneously stretching across such distances? But the technical virtuosity never felt like showing off. It felt necessary, inevitable, as if this music couldn't be expressed any other way. When the first movement ended, there was a moment of silence. Then, breaking concert protocol, some members of the audience began to applaud. The conductor glared at them. You weren't supposed to applaud between movements, but the applause came anyway, spontaneous and genuine. The second movement began. This was the heart of the concerto, the lyrical center, the melody that Rachmaninoff had heard in his mind during those dark days of depression. It was a love song, a lament, a prayer all at once. The piano sang with a tenderness that seemed impossible from such large hands. In the third row, even Kruglakov's pen had stopped moving. He was simply listening, his face unreadable. In the back, Scriabin leaned forward, his expression complicated. This was brilliant, undeniably brilliant. And it was brilliant in a way that he, Scriabin, with his elegant, normal hands, could never achieve. Rachmaninoff had found a voice that was entirely his own, built on the very physical attributes that should have been limitations. The melody swelled, and more people in the audience began to weep. There was something in this music that touched something universal, the experience of suffering, of isolation, of wondering if you'll ever feel whole again. Everyone in that hall had felt those things at some point, and Rachmaninoff's music gave those feelings a voice. The second movement ended with a quiet, almost whispered resolution. This time the audience maintained silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people afraid to break the spell, afraid to interrupt something sacred. Then the third movement exploded into life. This was Rachmaninoff unleashed all virtuosity and power and joy. Where the first movement had been dark, and the second tender, the third was a celebration. It was difficult, extraordinarily difficult, with passages that seemed designed to break the fingers of anyone foolish enough to attempt them. But Rachmaninoff played them with a combination of power and precision that left the audience breathless. There were cascading runs where his hands moved in opposite directions across the keyboard, covering impossible distances in impossible time. There were chords that required such wide stretches that some audience members literally gasped aloud. There were moments where the piano seemed to sing, to laugh, to shout with triumph. The orchestra matched him note for note, the two forces combining into something larger than either could achieve alone. The music built and built, driving toward a conclusion that felt inevitable and yet surprising. And then the final passage. Rachmaninoff had written it specifically to showcase what his hands could do. A series of enormous chords, each requiring his full 12-key span, each struck with perfect timing and force. His hands moved across the keyboard like birds in flight, like thunder given form, like the physical manifestation of everything he had endured and overcome. The final chord rang out. Rachmaninoff's hands stretched to their absolute maximum span, every finger engaged the sound filling the hall like a benediction. Then silence. Complete, total silence. For one terrible second, Rachmaninoff thought he had failed again. Then he heard it a single person clapping, then another, then a third. And then the entire hall erupted. People stood. They shouted. They applauded so hard their hands hurt. Some were crying, some were laughing. Some were doing both. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, beautiful. Rachmaninoff stood from the piano, shaking, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The conductor was embracing him. The orchestra members were standing applauding, some banging their bows against their music stands in the traditional musician's salute. His mother was sobbing in her seat, her hands over her mouth. Dahl was standing and applauding, a huge smile on his face. And in the back, even Scriabin was on his feet, applauding his expression, a mixture of admiration and perhaps a touch of envy, but genuine nonetheless. The applause went on for several minutes. People called for an encore, though there was no encore to give. This was a premiere, there were no other movements to play. But they wanted more. They wanted Rachmaninoff to know that what they had just witnessed was extraordinary. Backstage, Rachmaninoff finally allowed himself to breathe. His hands were still shaking. His entire body was shaking. Musicians and well-wishers crowded around him, offering congratulations, trying to touch him as if he were some kind of prophet who had just delivered a divine message. Scriabin made his way backstage and found Rachmaninoff. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other, years of complex history passing between them in silence. Then Scriabin extended his hand. "You've written something that will outlive us all," he said simply. "And you've done it in a way that no one else could." "Those hands," he shook his head. "They're not a curse, Sergei. They never were. Tonight proved it." Coming from Scriabin, this meant something. It meant that even his rivals recognized what he had achieved. But the most important moment came later, when the crowd had thinned and Rachmaninoff was finally alone in his dressing room. He sat at a small table, his hands resting flat on the surface, and he looked at them. "Thank you," he whispered. For the first time in his life, he said it to his hands without irony, without bitterness, without shame. Just gratitude. The next morning, Sergei Rachmaninoff woke to find himself famous. The newspapers that had once savaged him now sang his praises. Even Kruglikov, whose cruel reviews had once driven Rachmaninoff to despair, wrote with grudging admiration. Piano Concerto No. 2 represents a triumph of individual voice over conventional limitation. Rachmaninoff has taken what might have been viewed as physical abnormality and transformed it into artistic necessity. What his hands can do, no other hands can do, and he has written music that acknowledges this truth rather than hiding from it. This is not circus performance, as I once foolishly suggested. This is genius recognizing itself and having the courage to speak in its own voice. I was wrong about Rachmaninoff, and I am man enough to admit it. Other critics were even more effusive. One wrote Rachmaninoff's hands, which society once mocked, have proven to be instruments designed by fate for this very music. To hear him play his concerto is to understand that some gifts come wrapped in unconventional packages, and it takes a brave artist to unwrap them without apology. The concerto's success was not just critical, but popular. Within weeks, orchestras across Russia were requesting the score. Within months, orchestras in Europe were performing it. Within a year, it had been performed in London, Paris, Berlin, and even New York. Everywhere it went, it moved audiences to tears and left them standing in ovation. Other pianists attempted to play it, and most discovered they couldn't. Not fully. They could approximate the notes, but the passages written for Rachmaninoff's unique handspan defeated them. Some tried to rearrange the music to fit normal hands, but the rearrangements always felt like compromises, like beautiful speeches with words missing. The concerto had been written for one specific pair of hands, and it sounded best when those hands played it. Requests poured in for Rachmaninoff to perform. Concert halls across the world wanted to hear him play his concerto. He was offered teaching positions at prestigious conservatories. Wealthy patrons offered to commission new works. The world that had once rejected him now clamored for his attention. But perhaps the most meaningful response came not from critics or audiences, but from young musicians who had their own struggles with being different. A young pianist in Vienna wrote to Rachmaninoff, "I was born with fingers that are too short. Everyone told me I would never be a real pianist. But after hearing your concerto, after reading about your journey, I have decided to stop trying to play like everyone else and to find music that fits my hands. Thank you for showing me that being different isn't a curse." A composer in London with a physical disability wrote, "Your concerto has given me hope that my limitations might actually be possibilities in disguise. You've proven that the world doesn't need more normal artists. It needs more honest ones." Letters like these moved Rachmaninoff more than any critic's praise. He answered as many as he could, always with the same message: don't hide what makes you different. Use it. Transform it. Make it yours. The Moscow Conservatory, which had once admitted him with reservations, now celebrated him as one of their greatest graduates. They requested that he come speak to the current students to share his journey. When he did standing in the same hall, where he had once endured Scriabin's subtle mockery and critics' harsh reviews, he looked out at the young faces and saw his younger self in many of them. The ones who sat slightly apart from others, the ones who looked uncomfortable in their own bodies, the ones who had been told they were somehow wrong. "I spent most of my life ashamed of my hands," he told them. "I prayed for them to be normal. I would have traded them for ordinary hands without hesitation. But if I had succeeded in that trade, if God had answered those prayers, Piano Concerto No. 2 would not exist. And neither would I not really, because those hands were never separate from who I am. They were always meant to be part of my voice." He held up his hands for everyone to see, no longer hiding them behind his back or in his pockets. "Your uniqueness, whatever it is, isn't something to overcome," he continued. "It's something to explore. The world has enough people trying to be normal. It needs more people brave enough to be exactly who they are." There was one more person Rachmaninoff needed to see, Dr. Nikolai Dahl. He visited Dahl's clinic on a gray November afternoon, carrying the published score of the concerto. Dahl greeted him warmly, genuinely pleased to see his former patient thriving. "I brought you something," Rachmaninoff said, handing him the score. "Look at the dedication page." Dahl opened it and saw 2 NV. "Dahl." Sergei Dahl said quietly, "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." Rachmaninoff interrupted. "Without you, this music wouldn't exist. You helped me believe I could compose again when I was certain that ability was gone forever. This concerto is as much yours as mine." Dahl was silent for a moment, clearly moved. Then he said, "You know, in our sessions, I told you that you would compose again, that your hands were instruments of beauty. But I want you to know something, Sergei. I didn't give you those truths. I just reminded you of truths you had forgotten. The music was always in you. The gift was always there. You just needed permission to believe in it again." "Then thank you," Rachmaninoff said, for giving me that permission. As he left Dahl's clinic and walked through the Moscow streets, Rachmaninoff felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not happiness, not exactly. His nature was too melancholic for uncomplicated happiness. But peace. The sense that he was finally fully himself. His hands, those massive, unusual, remarkable hands, swung naturally at his sides. He no longer hid them. He no longer apologized for them. They had given him everything, and he was finally ready to receive the gift. Piano Concerto No. 2 became one of the most beloved works in the classical repertoire. Over a century after its premiere, it is still performed regularly in concert halls around the world. It has been featured in films used in commercials, sampled by popular artists. Its second movement, that achingly beautiful melody, has moved millions to tears, and it remains to this day one of the most challenging works in the piano repertoire. The hand stretches Rachmaninoff wrote into the score, those passages requiring a 12-key span, defeat many pianists who attempt to perform it. Some can approximate the notes by breaking chords or rearranging passages, but pianists who can play it as written are rare. Rachmaninoff's hands became legendary in the classical music world. They were measured, studied, photographed. Medical researchers examined them, trying to understand their unusual structure. Some suggested he had Marfan syndrome, a genetic disorder that affects connective tissue and can result in unusually long fingers. Others believed it was simply a unique genetic variation, a physical characteristic that appeared randomly like perfect pitch or unusual height. But Rachmaninoff himself never cared much about the medical explanations. His hands were simply his hands. They were the tools he had been given, and he had learned to use them. He went on to compose many more works, including 3 more piano concertos, numerous solo piano pieces, and symphonies that redeemed the catastrophe of his first symphony. But Piano Concerto No. 2 remained his most famous work, the piece that defined his legacy. He also became a celebrated concert pianist, touring the world and dazzling audiences with his technical abilities and emotional depth. When he played, audiences would watch those hands with a kind of awe, seeing them not as deformities but as instruments of beauty. Rachmaninoff lived until 1943, dying at the age of 69 in Los Angeles, where he had moved after leaving Russia during the Revolution. He died just days before a planned performance of Piano Concerto No. 2. His last words, according to those who were with him, were about music. Always about music. But his legacy goes beyond the notes he wrote or the performances he gave. His story, the story of a boy mocked for his difference who transformed that difference into his greatest strength, has inspired countless people who struggle with their own sense of not fitting in. There's a profound truth in Rachmaninoff's journey. What the world calls your flaw might actually be your most valuable asset. The thing that makes you different, the thing you've learned to hide or apologize for, might be exactly what the world needs from you. Rachmaninoff could have spent his life trying to play like everyone else, trying to minimize his unusual hands, trying to write music that didn't require his unique capabilities. And if he had done that, he would have been at best a competent pianist and a mediocre composer. Instead, he had the courage to embrace what made him different. He wrote music that only his hands could play properly. He stopped apologizing for his uniqueness and started celebrating it. And in doing so, he created something beautiful that has outlived him by decades and will likely outlive all of us. The moral of Rachmaninoff's story is not that being different is easy. It's not. The moral is not that everyone will immediately recognize your gifts. They won't. The moral is not that you won't face rejection, mockery, or failure. You probably will. The moral is simpler and more profound. The thing about you that you've been taught to hide might be exactly what you're meant to share with the world. Rachmaninoff's hands were his shame, then his tool, then his signature, then his legacy. They were always the same hands. What changed was how he chose to use them. Your difference, whatever it is waiting for the same transformation. The question is whether you have the courage to stop hiding it and start exploring what it can do. Because somewhere in your uniqueness, in the thing that makes you feel like you don't fit in the characteristic you've spent years trying to minimize or explain away, there might be a gift the world desperately needs. Rachmaninoff found his, and in finding it, he gave the world music that still makes people weep over a century later. What might you give the world if you stopped apologizing for being different and started celebrating it? So the next time someone tells you you're too different, too unusual, too strange to succeed at what you love, remember Sergei Rachmaninoff. Remember the boy with monster hands who prayed every night to be normal. Remember the young man driven to suicidal depression by failure and rejection. Remember the composer who couldn't write a single note for 3 years because he believed the critics who said he was a freak. And remember the artist who finally stopped apologizing, who embraced his uniqueness, and who created something so beautiful that it has moved millions of people for over 100 years. Your difference is not your weakness. It might just be your superpower. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that your uniqueness has value, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what makes you different? What have you been hiding that might actually be your gift? Your participation keeps these important stories alive and reminds us all that being different isn't a curse. It's an opportunity. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in the value of every unique voice. I'll see you in the next story.